It's a very great pleasure to moderate this Q&A session. I waited 26 years to meet Richard in person. We were both present in Rio de Janeiro in June 1992, but I was busy chairing the negotiations and had no opportunity to attend the two side events at which you were the presenter. We are very privileged to have Richard Sandor as our sixth lecturer, because he's a truly remarkable man. You heard earlier that the city of Chicago has called him the father of financial futures. He's also known as the father of carbon trading. And Time magazine has honored him twice and called him the hero of the planet and hero of the environment. Now, I'd like to ask you three questions before I open it to the floor. You played an important role in helping to solve the problem of acid rain in North America through market-based solutions. Yeah? As many of you may remember, several decades ago, acid rain was a serious environmental problem both in North America and in Europe. Acid rain refers to a phenomenon in which mostly power plants generated sulfur dioxide that goes into the atmosphere and come down to Earth as acid rain. And the acid rain destroyed forests and pollute the lakes. So it was not a good thing to have. And the question is, how do we solve this problem? Richard was able to help solve the problem in North America through a market-based solution. And I want you to explain to the audience what you did.
Many of you may not remember the existence of acid rain as a problem, but it was horrific. Actually, as a metaphor for acid rain, Michael Douglas made a movie called Black Rain, which was a runaway hit.
Yeah, Black Rain, yeah.
And it was everything that was going to destroy the U.S. It was, Pittsburgh looked like Beijing. There was no sun, there were no skies. And the idea was to put a cap on the amount of emissions nationally and then lower the cap over a period of time. The program was ridiculed and pilloried and vilified by almost all people. Number one, there was a group on the left that just wanted command and control and didn't like the idea of allowing a flexible mechanism. And the group on the right, didn't like it because it was an environmental good that was being created. So in going at it, when you know something is criticized by both extremes, it's probably good. The United States emitted 18 million tons of SO2 in the 80s. And the goal was to first cut it to 9 million and then to 4.5 million. The objective was fought rigorously under the fact that it would create higher electricity prices in the U.S. It would hurt our competitiveness in exporting. Any of this sound familiar?
Yeah, sounds familiar.
And that it would be the downfall of the power sector and industry in America, and it would bankrupt states like West Virginia, Ohio, Illinois, Kentucky, etc. We hit 9 million tons very quickly. Program started in 1990. The first trades occurred in 1993. We did the first registered trade. By 2000, in spite of the legislature renewing the program, emissions were cut from 9 million to 4.5 million to 3 to 4 million. If you look at the EPA website, what happened? Electricity prices went down. Power is cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
The EPA said the cost to the U.S. economy was $1 to $2 billion, and the reduction in medical expenses associated with lung disease is $123 billion a year. I don't know how many cost benefits where something costs you $1 or $2 and you get 100. That does not include 37,000 lives a year saved, nor does it include the restoration of rivers that are deacidified,
Yes.
forests, or anything like that. And I find it disconcerting that very few people know about this program and don't design things based on what worked. And so it's very important that all of you out there, particularly the students, and to tell you political realities, just to one small thing about the U.S. When I was in Washington advocating,
Go to the micro.
when I was in Washington advocating for cap and trade and carbon, the numbers may not be exactly accurate, so I know this is being recorded, so I'll be somewhat careful. Basically, I think that 2/3 of the senators voting on it were not in office when acid rain was a problem. And I don't think I met a Senate staffer over 30 in 2009, which means they didn't know that acid rain was even a problem. And this is a political reality because there is no memory. So thank you for the opportunity to share about that.
So the success of using the market to help solve an environmental problem, acid rain, inspires me to ask you whether there could be a market-based solution to a transboundary air pollution that we experience on a fairly regular basis in Southeast Asia. You know, air pollution caused by basically forest fires in Indonesia, land that's been cleared for palm oil plantations. We've so far been looking at other solutions which have not been very effective. Is there any lesson we can learn from acid rain that can be extrapolated to the haze problem in Southeast Asia?
I think you need a regional solution. While in acid rain, Professor Coe, it's mostly concentrated in the Midwest and Northeast, because what happened was it really was like Southeast Asia to the extent that pollution came about by coal-fired plants in the Middle West. They tried to eliminate it by requiring local laws. It's very important that I'm here under law and economics, because so you pass a law that basically says you can't have local deposition of acid. So as an economist, what is that? What do you think? Well, the natural reaction is the utilities built taller stacks. So you could blow it across Illinois to land in New York, and local regulations don't apply. We think of SO2 as a local problem, but it's really regional, just like it is here in Southeast Asia. It requires a regional agreement because local command and control or local markets when there are externalities,
Yeah.
just don't work.
But we have a regional agreement. There is an ASEAN agreement to reduce and to combat transboundary air pollution, or Haze. So the regional agreement is existing. Now, given that there is a framework, can you make a suggestion on?
Yeah, I would, one of the things I think is very important, that students of law and economics recognize, there's nothing more powerful than price. These cap and trade markets work because you have to think along the lines that it paid to pollute. So as a student of economics, the question is, how do people get paid not to pollute? You can't look at this as an issue, and for that reason, you can't look at it as punish the polluter sorts of policies. You have to create incentives to people and funny how that works. You put a price on an externality and you can make money by cutting emissions. Guess what? People cut emissions, and I think although we allow, and everybody is sacrosanct and sacrimonious about it, and said, oh, you can't price the environment. Ladies and gentlemen, we price food that way. And if you can price a commodity and expect price to stimulate production when there's scarcity and to stimulate consumption when there's lack of it, then if you can produce the world's food supply in a market, why can't we do it for the environment? I don't get it.
Okay, thank you. We'll reflect on what we can do to price pollution and to see whether we can use a market-based mechanism to tackle this problem of transboundary pollution. I want to transition you to another issue. You are a good friend of Professor Houston Kwa, who's here somewhere. Houston, are you still here? Yeah, Professor Houston Kwa is the father of environmental economics in Singapore.
He does we had dinner last night, so it's...
Okay. So,
and he understands better than anybody cost benefit. And,
Professor Kwa has edited a book called Singapore 2065. Yeah, and you have an essay in that book which I brought for you to refresh your memory. In this essay, you made an appeal to Singapore to say that, I guess your appeal is made to the Monetary Authority of Singapore and the Singapore Exchange, to the banks and financial institutions. You're saying to Singapore, hey, there is a new asset class that we are not pioneering, and the asset class is environment. Yeah? So could you explain in simple terms to the audience what you mean?
I meant that air and water, biodiversity, the preservation of species are all assets, and they are assets held in common. And my appeal to the government of Singapore was to continue on that. I have another amendment to that appeal, if I can make it to you, the audience. The People's Bank of China, helped establish a blockchain in Shenzhen. And it says, and rightfully so, it wants to make Shenzhen the smartest city in Asia. I don't think Singapore should give up that title that easily. This is an intellectually strong community with two great world-class universities, ranking, I think, 11 for an NUS's case and 12 in NTU. You have all of the ability, the human capital in this thing. If Singapore is to maintain its lead as a sustainable American city, it needs to get into this blockchain. If China is devoting the central bank resources to create payment systems, to finance agricultural loans, to do environmental things, Singapore should invest proportionately. It is your time. You have the human capital. You have the things. And what I said 5 years ago about environmental assets, I would like to humbly suggest that the authorities look at what's happening next door in China, what's happening in Africa. Singapore should own the blockchain, human capital, in the next 5 years if it is to take advantage of the opportunities that are coming. It's title insurance, okay? It's not only title, it's medicine and records like that. It touches every single way that can transform genetic engineering, medical records, et cetera. And if you truly want to be sustainable, you have to embrace that technology. Not cryptocurrencies, as speculation.
I think MAS has embraced financial technology. So embracing blockchain is on our agenda. And I think Singapore wants to be a smart city. It has also taken the lead to create a network of ASEAN smart city, as you know. So I think the ambition is there. The question is execution, I think. I would like to ask Houston to ask you the first question.
Okay.
Yeah. Houston, I hope you recovered from your trip. Would you like to ask Richard, your old friend, the first question?
I'm actually the father of 2 kids. Professor Sandor, nice to see you again.
Always a pleasure.
It's an interesting, insightful talk, actually. And most of us, I think, we may be familiar with the term blockchain and cryptocurrency, but we actually don't know what it really means. And I recall that just last semester when I was teaching this course in environmental economics, a student actually came up to me and said, I want to do a term paper on cryptocurrency and environment. And I had no idea actually what is the crux of all this cryptocurrency as it affects the environment. But it's a very interesting development. I think it's good that we all should learn more about it. My question is this, actually, just listening to you. You started off by talking about this divergence between perception and the reality. I was just wondering, is this a deliberate? In other words, what causes this divergence? Is it the markets or is it the government? And could there be more be done to make this converge? And sometimes there's money to be made from this difference in perception and reality. Take the case of China, for example. There's a lot that China has done, but most of the articles I read about the China's attempt at environmental governance is always severely criticized by Western authors. So I was wondering, I mean, if you look at the perception, people would just take that as a perception, but the reality is China has done a lot. So is this China bashing? I mean, why is there this China bashing? So what more could be done in terms of converging this?
But I think, Houston, would you like Richard to respond to him first?
Yeah, I think it's several factors that exist now. And we live in a world of sound bites. And we live in a world as academics where we see journalism picking up sound bites, and we see sloppy research. And people draw conclusions because they're sloppy. And I think it's very important that academic communities keep the rigor up, because I think there's so much information out there that's easy to get sloppy. And we're living in a 24-hour news cycle, and In that 24 news cycle, you get a headline, and, coal is reborn. And it doesn't much matter, and this is not a Republican or Democratic. It's also the journalists are a little sloppy, so are the academics a little sloppy, so am I a little sloppy, I mean, there is, in a quick soundbite world, tremendous rewards for Andy Warhol's 15 minutes of fame, okay? It used to be, that if you were and if I had the choice and I was sitting among, I would do a study today on the economic value of celebrity, okay? And it's enormous. If you take, 35 years ago, there's a popular singer in America, which some of you who are young may not remember, some of you may, by the name of Barbara Streisand. And Barbara Streisand, in the day, got $50,000 for a concert, and the opening act got $2,000. Now the opening act gets $10,000, and she gets $15 million. Okay, if we take a look at Jackie Kennedy's auction by Sotheby's of her jewelry, a $500 piece of costume jewelry that you could buy at Tiffany's goes for $50,000 because it was owned by Jackie Kennedy. So we have to recognize there's enormous economic gains by celebrity. And that causes a lot of the difficulties. Because you have celebrity, it doesn't mean that you have more value in what you say. Yeah. And I think that's a danger, okay. At least I'm talking about America.
Yeah. I would like to answer Houston Quark and say that the gap between perception and reality is not just confined to the field of the environment. It's a much more pervasive problem. And I would highly recommend to all of you a book, the title of which is Factfulness, and is written by a brilliant Swedish doctor called Professor Rosling, R-O-S-I-N-G. It's an amazing little book because it asks 10 simple questions. And I thought I'm fairly well informed, and I thought I will surely get at least 5 of them right, but I got all of them wrong. It asks you a simple question. There are 7 billion people in the world today. Can you guess how many billions are in low-income countries, middle-income countries, and high-income countries? And I thought there would be maybe 2 billion people in low income, 3 billion people in middle income, and then 2 billion in high income. But I was wrong. The reality is that there's only 1 billion people living in low-income country, and the bulk in the middle income, and 2 billion in high income. Another simple question he asked is, what do you think is the average longevity of the human population today? You take the 7 billion and average it. Is it 50 years, 60 years, 70 years? And the correct answer is 70 years. And I got that wrong too. So there are many reasons why we have certain stereotypical impressions of the world, some perceptions of the world, but when you test them against facts or reality, very often they are wrong, So the next person who will ask you a question is Dr. Gay Min, the former president of the Nature Society and recipient of the inaugural President's Award for the Environment. Min, please.
Thank you, Tommy, and thank you very much, Professor Sando, for a very insightful, thought-provoking talk. Now, I must say, I know even less about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency than Houston, I'm quite sure. And I also do not invest in it. But I'm very interested in what you said about its use in promoting environmental sustainability, if I didn't misunderstand you. Now, the little I have read about cryptocurrencies and blockchains and Bitcoin mining is that it is a huge consumer of energy, huge. I'm afraid I cannot reel off figures like you have. But how do you resolve this apparent paradox?
Again, to reiterate, that is a concern that I have. Alternatively, we are at a cusp of the underlying cryptocurrencies and mining. There are changes in verification methodologies that's going on. There's something called Bitcoin Lightning. Again, the real important thing that I want to reiterate, and if I can be redundant, it's really the underlying technology. The cryptocurrency is what gets all of the attention. This is, in my opinion, this is as important. It is the ledger and the public access to it. It's the underlying record keeping. It's a trusted network. The cryptocurrencies get all of the attention because they went from $200 to $20,000. And I think it's the same perception we're talking about was Europe's a failure at reducing carbon emissions because the price of carbon $6. That we have to be totally emphatic. There are bad effects of it. The good effects of it are, some of it encourages, things like Iceland using its excessive hydropower to develop, by people pursuing or selfishly trying to mine and sell a commodity. You're taking this excess commodity, which is going to fuel significant developments in the underlying technology. And we're having a change because it used to be that you moved the power plant to where the demand for power was. Now, the demand for power is mobile because it's nerds, right? The nerds are going to wherever there's cheap power. So if it's in Iceland, every geek in the world is going to mine in Iceland, no matter what the weather is. So what you're doing is displacing the old central power and building, facilities by changing the location of electricity. The simple answer to the question, that is the current use of electricity is downside, but it's the cost benefit of the value of the blockchain that has to be looked at, and that's the way I would look at it. I'd view it the way Houston does, and the acid rain program. Terrible, cost $1 billion, $2 billion, but it provided $125 billion. So it's a cost-benefit equation, and you're quite right that this is a bad use of power in and of itself.
Okay. I would like to invite, before I call on you, Katie, I would like to invite Professor Winston Chow. I don't know where you're sitting. Could I invite Professor Winston Chow to ask the next question? The reason I'm calling on him is that I would like to introduce him to the audience. Professor Chow is the only is the only Singaporean who is a member of the Ipcc, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they've just released their latest report in Korea. So Winston just returned from Korea. So Winston, please.
I think the previous question was what I wanted to ask with respect to energy consumption from Bitcoin.
Well, can you ask a new question?
Maybe related.
Wait, before you ask a question, could I take advantage of you and ask you to give us the two-minute summary of the latest IPCC report?
Can I say refer to tomorrow's Straits Times or Channel News Asia instead?
No.
Okay. The IPCC released a report on a special report on 1.5 degrees C warming effects and looked at contrasting impacts at 1.5 and 2 degrees C warming at a global scale. The news is not good, but there is still hope. That's the very short summary of what the report is. It's not good in terms that we are on a trajectory to exceed 1.5 degrees C warming anywhere between 2030 to 2052. We are on trajectory to exceed more than 3 degrees C warming at current emission rates. That said, the impacts at a global scale are not very pleasant, especially for small island states and for cities by the coast, which both features apply to Singapore. The good news is that there's still that timeline. There's still that opportunity to actually stop warming our path, our trajectory towards 1.5 degrees C warming. But certain boxes need to be ticked, primarily that of political will. And that is something that hopefully will be addressed this December in the next Conference of Parties in Poland.
Okay, your question?
Thank you, Prof. Koh. Prof. Sander, very good talk. Following up on the previous question on electrical consumption of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and blockchain, the thing is, do you think that there's a sort of future, maybe geographical bias towards nations that have the capacity to either be blessed with electrical capacity to have blockchain technology in place, like in Iceland? That this bias would be more towards these nations rather than the nations that really require that blockchain technology to enhance sustainability. Do you think that African nations or East Asian nations of low income will not have that opportunity to benefit most from blockchain technology?
I'm a contrarian, and so let me begin by saying, you know, the cell phone is a perfect example how you can leapfrog, right? So in countries like Pakistan, you didn't have to lay cable, you didn't have to do anything, you went by it. I think the big beneficiaries of the blockchain is going to be Africa, okay? And that we're going to see enormous use of people in payment systems that are strangled by the existing financial infrastructure. And if you give them a cheap way to access and you give them a cell phone, they're going to be able to figure out. And theoretically, there's no reason why. We had a project, and let me give you an example, in Kerala, at the Chicago Climate Exchange. And the idea was to take, Kerala is the poorest province in India. And
No. It's not the poor. One of the. But it's the most highly educated.
That's what
you know,
Professor,
highly educated.
I was going to
So the
follow
poorest is
that.
Bihar, maybe.
And Professor Koh, as usual, is ahead of me intellectually. So it is one of the poorest, but it is
Highly educated.
highly educated. We set up a program. There were micro biodigesters at the Chicago Climate Exchange. They weren't being used. So we went to an NGO in Kerala and said, if they take the manure and basically put it in a biodigester, which means the methane floats up, you run a slim pipe into the house, and it's used for cooking, and then you can sell the carbon credits on the Chicago Climate Exchange. We had an elaborate effort and a big fight with a lot of people at NGOs who said, well, you're not looking and inspecting at every biodigester. We said, well, we're going to try something they use in the space program. It's called statistical analysis. And if we can sample, maybe we can do it. So we have this obsession that you had to look at every single poor Indian farmer and see that they were actually using the biodigester. So we took some, law of large numbers, did some sampling, had some things going, and we had 10,000 rural poor making $20 a year, okay? That's a big difference in Kerala. We had 10,000 farmers, and the price of carbon was $4, and at $4 you could rationalize this. There were enormous co-benefits, by the way. The typical scenario was in Kerala at the time that the people who gathered the wood were young girls. So they kept them out of school, they had them fetching wood, and then you had lung problems because they were burning wood inside. We got to 150,000 rural poor in India before we sold the exchange. Mm-hmm. If the blockchain was there and remote sensing was there, we could have created wealth at 50 cents per carbon offset, and we could have monitored it and had ledgers. What they did in Kerala was they used to have a local celebration when the carbon climate exchange, and they used the carbon credits for shopping. So it actually was a cryptocurrency that people looked at it. If I had that technology 10 years ago, I think I could have gotten to, not I, but we could have gotten to 20 million rural poor, because all they would have needed was cell phones, remote sensors, and I could have built a blockchain and a registry with 90% of the poor people. So I think the leapfrog is going to benefit. You try to change American banks or American oil companies, where there are legacy infrastructures. When there's no legacies, I think, and I would hypothesize, and my teacher and dear friend, Ronald Coase, who wrote the foreword to my book, he and I used to talk. The Chinese miracle, in part, he hypothesized, and we co-hypothesized, was due to the fact that there was no legacy systems. And they started with a blank page in the late 70s, and therefore wouldn't reject things because there were rent seekers, there were people who had political power, there was fraud and stuff like that. So I would put forth the case that the lack of legacies and a changing technology is very good for people who don't have old infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And now that we would debate and have a lot of fun debating, but my argument is that we're going to see some very big surprises by leapfrogging.
So the short answer to you, Winston, is that since the mobile phone has become almost universal, it is empowering, not disadvantaging, The next question from Kirti Makani. Kirti, please.
Can I speak from here?
Why don't you use a microphone? Can somebody bring the microphone to them? So that.
Whatever little I've understood now about blockchain, it is a democratization of information and knowledge. And that's going to be a major shift, because I do a lot of work in India in the rural communities, and I see how empowered they are. And it may be mainstream that you're getting knowledge and information, but they create their own internal chains in different areas. So to me, this is a path forward in democratization of information and knowledge. Can you shed some more light on that for me?
Yeah, I think it's, look, I'm from A, America, B, from the University of Chicago, which has a certain, philosophy about law and economics and free markets.
Right.
And I think so many of the problems in the United States and worldwide are because of rent seekers, that people get economic power because they have political power. And the government will grant special interests, special licenses, and to my little extent that if you relieved rent seeking in India, the GDP would grow 15% a year and not 7% a year. And so if you democratize information, and if you give a cell phone to a farmer in the subcontinent, and they can look at rice prices in Chicago, and if in fact there's a certification of the fact that they're doing, all of a sudden now blockchain, Walmart tracks all of its supply. There's a way for some Indian farmer who has a small plot of land to basically, because it's recorded, to be a supplier to Walmart that it could never be without this underlying technology, let alone blood diamonds, let alone art that's stolen. In the last 3 months, I've gotten 2 calls, not 1, but 2, we collect photography, and my wife is an artist, and she does virtual reality. And I've got 2 people contacting me how we can work with young artists so there's not a theft of their intellectual property. And you can do that by recording it on a blockchain and getting a laser imprint for 60 cents. And all of a sudden, how many great artists are there in India that could never make it into the worldwide art market? And once they did, their work is appropriated or stolen, or singers, or performing artists. The fact that there's a public ledger is going to prevent a lot of intellectual theft of property, particularly human capital. And again, I'm so optimistic. The thing that has to go on is you need the leadership like the UN. So you've got to have a global mission, an ethical leader, and they've got a blockchain and a notion like that. But and you need a combination of collaboration between law and economics and science. We have to go back to what the intellectual world was in the 14th and 15th century, where there weren't just specialized who got paid money, Houston, to publish in, as we talked about last night, in professional journals that foster each other, or you can't come out of that or populate half of, government agencies from certain schools and things like that. I think if we have a UN leadership, we have democratization. Junk bonds democratized capital markets. And what do I mean by that? We forget junk bonds. The perception is that terrible. We forget that there was a crazy guy in Atlanta who dreamt about an international network. His name was Ted Turner. He was financed by junk bonds, okay? There was another crazy guy by the name of Terry McGaugh, and he envisioned a stupid thing called cell phones, and that was financed by junk bonds. There was a guy by the name of Bill McGowan who dared challenge AT&T and didn't like the idea of a monopoly in communication. He broke it. He was financed by junk bonds. The democratization of capital markets and the democratization of information can break the back of the rent seekers. As long as we have the academic community, the United Nations, intellectual leadership, and moral leadership, couple that with the things, and that's what's exciting about being able to talk to an audience. You are the best and the brightest. And the message is embrace change. It's good. This blockchain, don't be bothered by it. You know, it's no different than the cell phone or CNN, and it's information. The earlier question that comes about is the perception and reality. Do we understand it? But I believe unambiguously that through communications to audiences like this, the privilege of speaking here, seeing Tommy, and visiting, is what's necessary right now. And if we can harness it and all work together, I think the problems of this world, I have kids and grandkids, and I worry about them environmentally. I worry about them getting information. I tell my grandkids, don't believe everything you read in the newspaper. Question it. Who is the credentials? Who's that on television? Is that an analyst or is that an entertainer? And to ask questions as simple as that. And if you believe that way, I think, like wealth and all of that thing, these problems can be overcome by men and women's ingenuity.
That's very good. Esther Ann would like to ask you the next question.
Hello, Dr. Sander. Thank you for sharing such great insight. I have the honors to listen to the SecGen 2 weeks ago in the UN, talking about SDG and all that. And in every session that he talked about, he spoke, he said that the message is very clear. Climate change is running faster than climate actions globally, especially in terms of SDG. The finance part has not come in as fast as we want it to be. So definitely the sustainable financing need to step up really fast. In Singapore, we are an international financial hub, but unfortunately, actions on making use of sustainable financing, green bond, green loans, and all that are lagging behind. But we have the honors to have issued the first green bond in Singapore by a Singapore company, linking green building with financing. But unfortunately, after the first issuance in April 2017, there was hardly any, there was one bank that issued, and it was DBS. But other than that, there isn't any, uptake of sustainable financing or green bond for that matter. So I would like to see how we could make use of capital market and to speed up, to catalyze the green movement. And Michael Bloomberg is taking the lead to do that after spearheading the TCFD last year, 2 years ago, and he has been appointed by the SecGens to lead a climate financial international initiative to engage corporates and also big financial institutions to drive financing to speed up the climate action. What is your view that to really kickstart to get corporate and institutional investor, financial institution to help to move and the climate actions? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that it's critical, but it is ongoing. The CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, we're reaching at this, and the CFOs are now more concerned about the environmental perception. And it's not greenwashing this time. It's more powerful than that because it's return on equity and risks. Insurance companies, are taking a look at the way they underwrite and have these elaborate models, Monte Carlo simulations, 100,000 years of generating, hurricanes and things. And now they're beginning to say, hold on, maybe we should start looking at Hurricane Hugo in 1988, Andrew in 1992, and maybe the underwriting cycle ought to be 30 years and not 3,000 years if we're trying to price catastrophic cover. So I'm encouraged because we're seeing that happen, and I think we have to continue to push it in the academic world among law students. What is full disclosure? What does that mean for your SEC filings? My own experience is that, again, you have to make it, again, a humble opinion, but one that's controversial. There's Isaac Asimov, the great science fiction writer, said, never let your morality get in the way of doing what's right. Okay? And the fact is that we have to say do it because it's the right thing. You want to say do it because ultimately you'll be better off for doing it, not because it's guilt or anything like that or whatnot. The fact is that green bonds, green investments over the long period, if they are analyzed in the proper way, should produce statistically better returns. And I think you don't want to paint it, I don't want to, maybe some others do. I don't want to paint it as you should feel guilty because you're harming the planet. It's my job to say how you're improving the sustainability of your company if you're looking at corporate governance, if you're looking at gender, if you're looking at race, that this is a smart thing to do over the long run, and good companies do it. And the bad companies don't have bad practices in that way. So I think it's incumbent upon us not to sell it from the morality point of view, sell it from the sustainability point of view. If you want a sustainable enterprise, you have to look at these things. And it's, when I got started in the business or whatnot, it was always these are sin bonds because they are for booze or casinos. And I think we've got to emphasize the returns to those green bonds, the returns to investing, and what's going to be a better investment, do all of you think, in the next 20 or 30 years? I teach at the University of Chicago, and I'll end with this quick thing. And the day after a pronouncement of Washington, one of the CFOs of the biggest consumer of coal in the United States and in the world spoke to the class. And one of the students at the University of Chicago said, well, what do you think? Because there was an announcement about a rebirth in coal, and he shall go unidentified, although he said it publicly in the class. He said, we will never build another coal plant in America, okay? Period, end of story, because you're not going to bet against renewable energy. And this is a 35-year investment. And why am I going to try to recover capital, take the risk, political risk, environmental risk, but worse than that, have a 35-year investment in something bad? So this was a business decision. He didn't care what the price of coal went to. He just said, I'm not going to build it. So it's a long-winded answer, but very important.
I think we have time for maybe just 2 questions, or the 3 questions. So why don't we take all the questions, and then Richard can give a composite reply to everybody. Why don't you go first? Yeah. If you can keep it short, please.
Yeah, so this is a question about Trump. You were talking about perception is that Trump will kill the environmental movement or rejuvenate coal. But the reality is, look, California just redid cap and trade, and actually, the coal energy market is bigger than the gold market. But I'm trying to understand what should be the right counterfactual. Should we think this is the right counterfactual, or actually, if Trump did the right things, the growth of the energy market will be even bigger than 120% of gold, or maybe will be around 150%.
Okay. All right, thank you. Wait, don't answer. Let's take all the questions. You, please, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Good evening, Dr. Sander. Thank you very much for being here today and for sharing your insights with us. If I tell you that I've spent most of the last 20 years working for Eurex Life and Ice, you might be able to understand how excited I am that you are here today. 2 years ago, I made a transition to work in sustainability. I work for Singapore's longest-standing sustainability consultancy, and I still obviously have a very soft spot for exchanges. I think that exchanges can be incredibly powerful in making change and making change happen for sustainability. Hence my question for you, in your mind, what is currently the biggest opportunity in sustainability that's waiting to be seized by an exchange? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Another question? Can you pass the microphone to him? No, please. Can you turn around and ask your question? Yeah, please.
Sorry, my name is Frank Joshua. Dr. Sander and I have been friends and colleagues for almost 30 years. And so I just wanted to stand up and say hello to him and to thank him for his usual excellent erudite presentation.
Oh, thank you.
I happen to come from the Caribbean, but I was a United Nations staff member, the person who started carbon trading at the UN. That's how Richard and I met each other.
So both of you are fathers of carbon trading.
Sort of.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned the seminars in Rio back in 1992.
Yeah.
The carbon trading seminars were organized by me
I see.
and included Richard Sander and a team of international experts.
Oh, wonderful.
I just happen to live in Singapore these days.
Yeah.
I've been in the Asian region now for 12 years, most of that in China. I'm still involved in China, but I needed some place to rest my head. And I happened to pick Singapore.
You're very welcome here.
So I'm delighted to see Richard, and I haven't seen him in years. I hope we'll have 5 minutes together. But thank you very much.
Thank you. And I hope the green community will embrace you and seek your advice and your support. Thank you. Is there a final question? Oh, one. Yeah, please.
We start answering them very quickly so
No,
I don't
no,
forget all of them.
No, I'll remind you what the questions are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your innovative lecture. I'm a year 3 PhD student from Shanghai Jiao Tong University, and I have lived in Shanghai for almost 10 years. Shanghai government forbids setting off fireworks in order to protect the environment. Actually, we set off fireworks for celebrating festivals and the other important things. Forbidding setting off fireworks damages the seller's profit. We choose to protect the more level spirit of law of protecting government and collective human rights. by comparison with celebrating the traditional festivals. We are still sacrificing some intrinsic rights and interest in order to breathe pure air. So what's the limitation between protecting environment and ignoring some rights? How do we estimate it? Thank you.
Did you get that, Richard?
I think so. It's the trade-off between the environmental, negative environmental impacts of rice farming.
Yeah, right. Okay. So the first question was about President Trump. Second question was, what is the next big thing in sustainability? The third is not a question, but to say hello to you. So can you give a composite reply to all the questions?
Yeah, let me first say, again, the most important lesson there is the United States is a federal republic. And Justice Brandeis said the states are laboratories for federal policy. And because there's a pronouncement, and it is a federal republic by the central, it could be like Newtonian. It could produce an equal and opposite reaction at the state level. So I think you have to be very careful to take the words of any president. And if you go back and take a look at what George Bush said, Barack Obama said, or Donald Trump said, many of the things that they pronounced were in fact public policies, were totally pushed back at the state level. So, you know, I think the message there is, and I think what we saw in California, I am a reporter of facts and not an interpreter. The decisions in Washington resulted, or there was a decision in Washington to be less environmental, and the decision in the state of California was to be doubly environmental, increase the targets, cut carbon emissions, and by 2045, this is a state that's produced, you know, chips and stuff like this, and then extend the program and have a carbon-free economy. And if you would have ever said that Silicon Valley is going to be the home of the automotive sector in America, they would have locked you in a rubber room, okay? And that an old Ford plant would become a producer of electric cars. So that's the answer to that question. The answer to the question is water and other IP related to biodiversity, and to use markets to preserve endangered species. That if you can lock up those two things, and if I could live another 100 years, I would have, you know, I have more ideas and fun to be had in working on the problems that will exist, and harnessing intelligent exchanges to do it, and so we do that. Frank, thank you. Frank and I met in Geneva in 1990, and I went to Rio, and he asked for me to write a paper on designing market architecture we sat in December of 91, I believe, in Geneva in a room, and he said, you worked on sulfur, how about working on carbon? And I went to Rio, and thank you, Frank. He resulted in a lifelong partnership with Maurice Strong, who was the Secretary General of the United Nations and my vice chairman for the Chicago Climate Exchange in Tianjin. I think I answered
Prof. Tomiko, we have one more question from the lady. She's been waiting for a while.
I think no more question. Yeah,
give her a last one. Go ahead. She took the phone and it was ripped out of her hands, so I'm sympathetic. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
So what I understand from your discussion is basically applying, correct me if I'm wrong, Western environmental methods to Asian countries. What do you think about traditional environmental methods? Like over here, there's something called Karan Gayus who collect trash. In India, there's something called Raddiwalas who collect trash. Do you think these are complementary, Western and Asian methods of environment, whatever, like environmental?
I think
You get what I mean.
indigenous practices to support the environment, whether the West would accommodate these Asian and other indigenous practices. I think of this, obviously the answer is yes.
Yeah, you know, the simple answer is yes. I mean, I think that we're living in a different world today, and at least if you take a look at the friends that I keep, it would be, and true, we're free market, but we tend to be extraordinarily welcoming. And I think, by the way, just as a personal practice in myself, and I, you know, at times I have a bad back and ruptured discs, and I've taken acupuncture. I take my younger daughter, she and I, father and daughter, and spend a week with Deepak Chopra doing yoga and meditating. So I happen to think that the wisdom contained in Eastern medicine and thought processes and all of that, it's a bias because I think I have an Asian soul.
Thank you, Richard, for having an Asian soul. And thank you for this very inspiring lecture and Q&A session.
Thank you all. You are the best and the brightest.
Thank you, audience, and thank you, everyone, for your insightful questions. And this brings us to the end of the 6th Asia Environment Lecture 2018. On behalf of the AEL Organizing Committee, may I now invite Professor Tommy Koh and Dr. Stander remain on stage while Professor Tommy Koh presents the tokens of appreciation to Dr. Sander. The painting that Dr. Sander is receiving is by Mr. Daniel Tan, from the mouth and foot painting artist in Singapore. Despite being paralyzed from his neck downwards, he's actually mastered the art of painting with his mouth. And the books that Dr. Sander will be receiving is the complete series of the 6 volumes of Sustainability Matters. This is a compilation of some of the best dissertations and research papers submitted by students in the MEM program. He will also be receiving the book Environment and Climate Change in Asia, Ecological Footprints and Green Prospects, a collection of essays to mark the 10th anniversary of the MEM program. Thank you, Dr. Sander.